Welcome. This is History Theory, and today we discuss the question, what if the South had won the U.S. Civil War? But before we think about what might have happened, we have to think about what really happened. Despite its name, the United States of America has long been fraught with division and disunity, and there's no better example of this than the U.S. Civil War. Prior to the mid-1800s, the U.S. endorsed and heavily used systematic slavery. American slaves were mostly used for labor-intensive agriculture and the harvesting of crops, especially cotton. The life of a slave was absolutely brutal, to say the very least, and the repercussions of American slavery can still be felt today. Starting in the mid-19th century, many Americans began to consider the abolition of slavery, especially people in the northern areas of the United States, which were becoming increasingly industrialized. Abraham Lincoln was elected president in the year 1860 with an anti-slavery standpoint. However, in the South, which had an increasingly agricultural economy that heavily used slaves, people, especially rich plantation owners, were against this point of view. To them, their slaves were the foundations of their profits, and they didn't want to give that up. Soon after Lincoln was elected, 7 states in the South seceded from the U.S., and more would join them. They formed the Confederate States, or the Confederacy. The states in the North who remained loyal to America were known as the Union. Conflict seemed inevitable between the two sides, and the fighting broke out in early 1861. The war would be fought between the Confederates of the South and the Union in the North, and more Americans died in the Civil War than in both world wars combined. But in the end, the southern states didn't have as much of a chance. The North had both a higher population and a higher level of industrialization. This not only led to a larger military advantage over the South, but also a higher level of technological warfare. The North had better weapons and a more well-equipped military, and the support of more people. And although the South won many battles in its day, the North would officially defeat them in 1865. But even though slavery would be banned in all American dominions except for criminals, the lasting racism and hate towards black Americans, in addition to division between traditionally northern and southern values, would continue long afterwards. The Civil War, in many ways, permanently altered the history of the United States. But what if the war had had a more unpleasant end? What if the South had won the U.S. Civil War? Assuming that the South had somehow overcome the North rather than simply repelling them, the United States would be a very different nation. Not only would it be controlled by a Southern-led government, this Southern-led government would be placed to control one of the most powerful nations in the world. The fate of the Native Americans, for instance, would have likely been different. Conservative American leaders after the Civil War might have put more of an effort into a war against them. Shifted views and values would control the fate of many in the path of the newly revolutionized United States. The Civil War would have likely been known as the Second Revolutionary War, in which, once again, a government was overthrown and replaced. America's relationship with European nations may not have been as strong, as countries such as England and France failed to recognize the Confederacy as a legitimate state during the Civil War, and likely would have been skeptical or cautious towards the new United States. The South would have inevitably destroyed the idea of emancipation, but nevertheless, division over the issue would still ensue. Abolitionists and other people against slavery would no doubt continue to campaign and protest for freedom, potentially causing much civil unrest, especially in the North. The nation would have been far less stable as a whole, and further division might have led to violence, or even another civil war, which would have resulted in even greater loss of American lives. Eventually, of course, Americans would have come to their senses and slavery would have been abolished. However, it would have been a much rockier course to have tread, and much more human pain and suffering would have been involved. Because of this instability, who knows how America would have looked at the turn of the 20th century. Maybe it would never have been strong enough to participate in World War I and, by extension, World War II. A weaker and less ethically sound U.S. may well have shaped the history of the world in more ways than one might seem. Without America to become a world leader by the latter half of the 1900s, it's impossible to say for certain how things would have turned out. Who knows how the history of the modern Middle East would have turned out, for instance? Perhaps Alaska would still be under Russian influence. Would America ever have invented the atomic bomb? Maybe not. The Civil War was undoubtedly a turning point in the history of the United States and the world, and shaped the course of history forever afterwards. This has been History Theory. Subscribe for more content, and I hope you enjoy the rest of your day.